published a book about the Delta Chinese in Mississippi who ran grocery stores for much of the last century. Here are the two covers, the original cover and then a revised cover. But since the book was published about a decade ago, it's hard to keep it up to date as new material arises. And so I created a website that would provide opportunity to put in additional information that was not available in the published paperback or electronic ebook. Unfortunately, the site is going to close in about a month, and it's a lot of work to reconstruct and transfer this website. So what I'm going to do is try to make a short video that illustrates some of the highlights. It'll go kind of rapidly, and so you won't be able to see everything, but at least you'll get a general idea of what is contained on this website. This is an iconic photograph created in the 1930s by photographers commissioned by the government to go and record the Depression. The Joe Gao News Store was legendary in the foot of the Washington Street down at the levee in Greenville. You can see that the store...
The traditional Chinese settlements. We came here instead to rural Mississippi.
In a Mississippi cotton picking Delta town, one dusty street to walk up and down.
Mississippi in the early 1900s was a land of opportunity for Chinese. There was a wide gap between the white and black populations, a gap within which the Chinese could establish themselves as storekeepers. And that was a long step up from the back-breaking labor of a Chinese laundry. There was another, even more compelling reason for establishing a business. The laws of the time said that the wife of a Chinese was classified by her husband's job. The wife of a laborer was herself a laborer in the eyes of the law.
Chinese laborers had been excluded in 1882, and that law had been renewed every 10 years. That other Chinese could still come, and Chinese who were classified as merchants or as preachers or travelers could come.
So setting up a store in Mississippi cleared the way for my grandfather to bring his wife and son to America. But no one said that life here would be easy.
You work for 12 to 14 hours a day. Often many times we get up early in the morning, around 4 or 5 o'clock to kiss the early morning. Cotton chopping, time, the people go to field work. If you don't catch that early business, then you miss the main good part of that business. Everything you have to do it by yourself. Put merchandise on the stop. You're the floor sweeper, you're the cashier, you're the manager, you're a chop suey of everything.
WJBR 1330, Greenville, Mississippi. I remember the life in one of those small Mississippi towns. We were balanced on the edge between black and white. In the middle of the night, I could hear B.B. King wailing from a black cafe behind the store.
Rock me, baby. Why you rock me all night long?
And across the street, Hank Williams from the white side of town.
Got the line of crawfish, pine, a filet gumbo.
They're not allowed the Chinese people go to high school. They're not allowed the Chinese people go to barber shop. They're not allowed the Chinese people go to the restaurant. They're not allowed the Chinese people go to hotel. They're not allowed the Chinese people go to the even sick to the hospital.
My Aunt Annie was the first Chinese woman from Mississippi to go to college. But when she was a teenager, a member of the Board of Education told her that Chinese could not go to public schools.
I sat there crying, and I was very angry and very mad. And I do remember sitting there. It's very hard to sit there and talk to somebody being a young person, and it's not, 13 is not very old, and talking to a grown man and demanding that you be able to go to public school.
Grandfather, he, in spite of all these conditions, he still encouraged us to go to school, get the best training possible, so that when we get out, we make our best effort to make a success here. Otherwise, well, go back to China and utilize our professional training there.
My grandparents came to Mississippi like thousands of other Chinese families because they believed they could succeed here. It didn't have to be San Francisco or New York City. They preached the American dream, that hard work would produce good results. Next, we'll see how that lesson was learned by the new generation. In Interview in Mississippi, this is Sam Chu Lin, News Center 4.
So I got the opportunity to visit several grocery stores in the Delta that Frida Kwan took me to. One of the interesting ones was Maria Joe's grocery store, which I visited in Greenwood. And so they were to take a few pictures.
Some of those people work in slime. They come over and get it.
Yeah.
Sunday.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's the only thing, you know.
Yeah, you have more.
About that.
Yeah, you have more than Home Depot.
Sometimes when they come over here, I find a little small school. I say, hurry up, you're a lifesaver. I said, they couldn't find it, nowhere to find it.
Yeah.
So Sunday, sometimes I open, sometimes I don't.
So you're probably the biggest store in town, huh?
It is not, it's still.
In terms of merchandise.
I have filled the store down one of the Chinese stores. It's kind of like big like this. Not quite, but it's pretty good size too.
You have a second store? Or you have another store?
I got one over there in the Avenue G. That was my first store.
Oh, so who's looking after that store?
No, I sold it to
you don't have it anymore.
No.
Oh, okay. It's good.
Yeah, I know some of these, know some of that. So how long you will stay in Mississippi?
About one more week.
Another week.
Yeah.
So you'll go back.
Yeah.
I hope you can get what you want over here. I mean.
Get what?
I hope you can get, some idea.
Yeah, it's helpful. I mean, to actually see, what I've been reading about, and it helps. So, you saved all your declarations from...
This is one of my friends, he gave to me. He the one make this. He didn't come today because his wife was here sick.
Oh, okay.
So I invited him, but he said, I don't come.
So what do you store in there?
Oh, it was a walk-in cooler.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. Used to be just ice in there, probably.
Yeah.
you can see that Maria had quite a bit of interesting merchandise in her store. We also went to another store that was operated by Chun and Kit Leung, and I believe this was in Greenville, if I remember correctly. Yeah, in Greenville. And it was a much smaller store.
Well, when I was growing up, I left all my junk for my mother.
It's true. You know, I told my girl, you want some, you come get it. And then she, if I don't know, he shoot me back.
But anyway, what happened to my junk was my mother had a storage house, and she built it back.
So we're in the back side of the store.
Everything got thrown out.
Sort of storage and office space.
So then I don't have to worry about my junk anymore because it's all gone. So I got more junk now.
The actual store is off to the right.
Always move. You won't sit down?
So we're behind the screen. Takes us into the private part of the store.
They look like a house family. They don't look like a business.
So there's the store through that window. So the separation is for protection from robberies and so forth.
Some kind of stuff coming, you visit.
Old cash register.
It's just two of you.
Sometimes not really busy, but they come not much time there. This time the business not, they tend to add too much. They ain't got sales coming. They sell, bad sales.
Oh, in Greenville, the Chinese had their own cemetery because they were not welcomed in the white cemetery. This film was made as sort of a tour, so the people visiting are all white. They are part of a National Endowment for the Humanities seminar to look at historic landmarks. Chow were featured in a piece in the New York Times called East Meets South at a Delta Table. So they got the Chow family to pose on a tractor down in Clarksdale. And an interesting interview with 100-year-old virtually Pat Pang, who was part of the Marx family. Very vivacious, lively interview with him, where he talked about some of the early history of the Chinese in the Delta, probably from back in the 1920s and 1930s. Because of the segregation that prevented Chinese from attending white schools until the late 1940s, the Chinese opened a boarding school, one in Cleveland, with the Baptist mission, and students who lived too far from the school boarded there, and that was their opportunity to get a better quality education. There was a commemorative marker placed for the school and a reunion of some of the people who had gone to school there. Betty Diamond Jew Dickard represented the Chinese from the Delta at the Angel Island Immigration Station dedication of the memorial wall, where people put up plaques honoring their ancestors in 1912 at a large ceremony. Some of these videos are on YouTube, but they don't show up on this blog. But now were interviews with Luck Wang of Jonestown, who, along with his brother John, were mayors of small towns in Mississippi Delta. Interview with Frida Kwan, who helped me immensely with making contacts and helping me with writing the book, doing the research for writing the book of Chopsticks in the Land of Cotton. She grew up in Greenville. Parents ran the Min Thang grocery store, which was then later operated by two brothers until fairly recently when they retired. Raymond Wong has a short video about one of the few Chinese restaurants in Greenville, the How Joy, which no longer exists. So when it comes back to opportunities for Chinese children, as early as 1927, there was a challenge to the segregation preventing Chinese children from going to white schools. In a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, because Gong Lum wanted to test the ruling that his daughters could not go to public school in Rosedale. Initially, they got a favorable reading from the Mississippi Supreme Court, but it was then challenged and taken to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld segregation. And Gong Lum shortly thereafter moved his family over to Arkansas, which had less segregationist views about Chinese children going to white schools. This is the one-room schoolhouse where you had children from 6 to 15 or whatever taught in this Greenville one-room schoolhouse. The church, the Baptist church, was very instrumental in Cleveland in providing opportunities for Chinese immigrants to learn English and for opportunities for the children to become Christianized and also study school lessons. Chinese were surprisingly very active in sports, which I found somewhat surprising, especially football. I didn't think many Chinese parents would approve of their sons engaging in such a rough and tumble activity as football, but evidently they did. The Chinese Baptist Church, as I mentioned before, was very important in its role among Chinese in the Delta. Ted Shepard was a reverend for the church in Greenville, and he served the community for several decades, and quite a staunch champion for the Mississippi Chinese. Hoover and Freda Lee had a grocery store in Louise, Mississippi, and they were interviewed as part of a research study by some sociologists, and there's a short video about their views. And I include part of my chapter on racial issues from my book, chapter 7, Chopsticks in the Land of Cotton, looking at the so-called Mississippi Triangle of races, where the Chinese were neither black nor white, but sort of sandwiched in between, and having to negotiate successfully to do business in the Delta. So many of the Chinese in the 40s and 50s had difficulties even getting jobs or being treated in line with their qualifications. So in the civil rights movement in the 60s, it was a very difficult situation because the Chinese were neither black nor white, and they had to somehow negotiate and survive in establishing good relationships with both blacks and whites. A very delicate juggling act, to say the least. Here's some other information. The Chinese in the Delta in the in the probably early 2000s, probably around maybe 2010, I'm guessing, really put a move on to create a Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Museum, which is on the 4th floor of the Delta State University Archives in Cleveland. And they've collected quite a few donations of artifacts and ephemera from grocery stores, and it's quite interesting place. and certainly a very worthwhile way of preserving records of the history. Here at a football game, and as everyone knows, football is quite the most popular athletic event or activity in the Deep South. And Pat Pang, who lived to over 100, I believe, was honored during halftime, probably maybe when he was 95 or whatever. He was a veteran who served in the Navy, so it was quite a landmark recognition. And other Delta Chinese went on to be on various talks and panels and activities related to promoting the history of the Mississippi Delta Chinese. Paul Wong, who grew up in the Delta, well, he didn't actually grow up there, but he lived there. He had actually been in Portland and North Dakota before moving to the Delta. But he did go to the school at the Chinese Mission School, and so around 2011, they had a reunion of some of the alumni and had them write stories about their lives and published it in a book called Reflections and Reminiscences. Maybe that's not the exact title, but it is a collection of stories, of little short bios of some of the graduates. And created a Facebook page for the Mississippi Delta Chinese as well, which is quite active and ongoing, unlike this website. There have been a number of books, starting with James Lowen, who was a prominent activist and sociologist in the 1970s. He was a student in the Delta, and he wrote a sociologically oriented book called The Mississippi Chinese. Robert Kwan wrote a book called Lotus Among the Magnolias, which was a less academically oriented book with many descriptions and interviews of some of the older Chinese in the Delta from the 30s and maybe earlier than that. And then my book, Chopsticks in the Land of Cotton, which came out in 2007. And there were various articles in journals and magazines about the Delta Chinese. And the Cleveland, Mississippi Heritage Museum has collected a number of biography, oral histories, some collected in the 1990s and again some collected probably after 2015. And various reflections that people who grew up in the Delta shared. Here are links to several discussions or panels, talk I gave about the Mississippi Chinese, a panel of 5 people who grew up in the Delta talking about their history. a display in 2007 or 8 in the ground floor of the Delta State University archives with artifacts from various families that were contributed to the museum. So this is a rich history. The more you dig, the more you find out about a lot of things that have been forgotten or not recorded or collected. So in 2014, there was a large-scale reunion with over 300 or 400 people who came back to the Delta from all over the United States. And there were some talks and lectures, and there were a lot of socializing and reunited people who had moved away from the Delta, where they grew up, and they were coming back for the first time in as many as 50 years. So it was quite a venture. They got to go and see the museum, and it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I got to do a presentation as well as several other prominent scholars. Adrian Berard, a journalist who wrote a outstanding analysis and history of the Gonglong case, Water Breaking Boulders, I believe was the name of the book. And that was a celebration when the state posted a historic marker for the Chinese mission school. A lot of interest in the Delta in terms of their cooking, and some major documentarians and cooks have come down, especially to see how Gilroy and Sally prepare Southern style Chinese food. And we have some documents from some stores on the other side of the river in Arkansas. So unfortunately, this website is going to be taken down, but I'm transferring some of this information over to another site on another platform. It'll be called Chopsticks in the Land of Cotton .weebly, WEEBLY.com, and there'll be newer material, and hopefully it will continue to be added to. So that gives you an overview of this site, which was very useful, but unfortunately will no longer exist in a few weeks.